prison. So we are being recorded now. You know that. When I saw the topic for what we would be discussing tonight, Colorblind or police and as far as prison. I volunteered for this. Because from my own, before I go. I'm a faculty member here in the social department. For roughly 20 years, taught a class called Prison Life at Vanderbilt, where among other things we talk about flawed and inherently problematic. This past year also has a portion that's possibly partner brother called where we talk about all things police, very specifically with our work. When I saw that we had a Racial Justice Teachout focused on police and I had some people in mind who I would reach out to as subject matter experts to facilitate this discussion or this conversation we'll have here today. So without further ado, we'll actually have our panelists introduce themselves, then I will proceed with your questions. We will provide time for you to ask questions in the room. We also have a place in space for those of you that have questions. We'll start with the gentleman to my immediate right. So if I will share a little more about how we met. He loves when I tell this. I mentioned that I've been teaching the prison life class. Never forget my very first time in that class. I'm 26 years old, fresh out of grad school. And I take a tour. Take my class on a tour, and we go visit River Bend Maximum Security Institution. And that is where I met my good friend, Raheem Duker. At that time, he was not a friend that day. That day, he was very mean to me, but it was in good fun, though. It was good, jovial fun. I remember walking into the gallery, and he just starts grilling me. What percentage of Black people in? I guess I asked them all right. We've been pretty good friends ever since then.
Thank you. Thank you for this opportunity. It's an honor just to speak, particularly just being in the Black Culture Center. And we are friends. And he was one of the youngest professors I think I met during the time that I was incarcerated. And I always hated when he came into the prison with the zoo effect. Look at them, and I just really wanted to know if he had the information, the education to really be doing what he was doing, and he did. And we have been friends ever since. Just briefly, again, I'm Raheem Duker. I'm from Nashville, Tennessee. I'm a native. And what brings me to this space, early on in my life, got into some situations with the law. And that just progressed to the point to where I was charged with felony murder. And eventually I would end up with a life and 20-year sentence. And I would be caged. I like to say caged. A lot of people say they serve time, they're incarcerated. These are very sanitized terms. They don't really give the meaning of what happens to a human being who is behind bars. I was caged for 26 years of my life at 7 different prisons throughout the state of Tennessee, from mid all the way back west. And during those periods of my incarceration, I didn't give up. I continued to believe that there was hope, there was freedom. I knew that I had a death sentence in terms of it being life plus 20, but I had faith, and I just continued to be on that journey. And eventually, after 3 parole hearings, I would be released in 2015 of June. I would leave with a scholarship, about 15 college credits, and an indignant spirit of determination, a desire to inform society about not only what I experienced, but what many other young Black men and women are experiencing in prison all throughout just Tennessee. I could talk about United States, but I think Tennessee is specific because it's one of the states that locks up more of its citizens than any other place, even in the world. in top 5. And so I graduated from American Baptist College. I would go on, I worked with the Nashville Children's Defense Fund. I was the bail fund, Nashville Community Bail Fund manager for about 2 years. And I founded the Unheard Voices Outreach, which is an organization that reaches back into the prison, and more or less, we aim to organize prisons in Tennessee. We help prepare individuals with parole and their family members. And we work on policy issues to decarcerate Tennessee. And I've been out of prison for nearly 7 years, coming this June. And I feel like I'm more driven now than I was before, because it's worse than it was, at least the way I feel. So happy to be here today.
Thank you for that.
Everyone speak more directly into the mic. I know some of the folks on here were having trouble hearing.
First, my name is Jamel Campbell. I'm also from here. And I grew up here. My family has been here for 10 generations. We grew up on the land. Anything that has happened in Nashville has happened to my family. First, let me say I'm a police abolitionist and prison abolitionist. I don't think that we can reform them. I don't think that we can adjust them to make them a little less harmful. I think as long as they are around, they will adversely affect Black folks, and we will feel the majority of that harm. Secondly, I want to mention, and I do want to state the obvious, that it's 3 men up here speaking about prisons, when there's actually a very specific relationship to prisons, police, and how they actually exploit Black women. If you look at a lot of our women who experience the mass incarceration or the prison industrial complex, we know that they're not only in prison, they're in confinement, halfway homes, suspension, in-school suspension, all of those things. And so what I want to do is I want to make sure we center that when we talk about police and prisons, it's actually a very complex and dense network of disciplines that not only permeate through prisons, police, but also permeate through school resource officers, SROs, in-school suspension, expulsion. All of these are arms of the same beast, right? So I want to make sure to say that. But me, myself, I'm a police and prison abolitionist. I'm a community organizer. That means that I do most of my job, most of my time, is through talking directly with the people, because it's the people that are going to actually provide change to this situation. Secondly, I also want to mention, I'm a community organizer with the Black National Assembly. We specialize in having conversations with Black folks about what are the problems that we are experiencing and what are the solutions. A lot of the time, and I have an organizing partner in the crowd right now named Erica Perry, who's also a movement attorney. A lot of the times, if folks notice, we are looped into this BIPOC language, people of color, but there's still a very specific experience that Black folks have with these institutions that were founded to hurt us and limit our ability to be around. So I'm a community organizer. I'm really excited to have this conversation with folks today, but I just want to mention and hold that these systems that we're about to talk about in center today, policing, any type of punitive discipline that you can think about, was created to harm and house and cage Black folks. And I believe that we cannot make these a little bit better. We cannot adjust them. We cannot reform them. The only way forward is to the complete dismantling, to replace it with something brand new.
I feel like we need to snap on that one for a minute.
Absolutely.
Let's my first question is, you both do some very passionate work in the lanes that you do it in. What motivates and inspires you to do the work that you do? We can start with you, Rahim, and thinking about.
Yeah, that's a great question. Obviously, my experience of being caged and connecting that to the African-American, Black American experience. And when you look at what's happening in Tennessee, there is a demographic of young Black males who are back west and Northwest, Hardeman County. And these young men are being treated literally like animals. They're being locked in cells, cages 24/24. There's so much death surrounding them. There is a drug overdose epidemic of heroin within the prison punishment system. And so seeing all of that up close and personal, all of those years that I was incarcerated, in the pain, the racism, I knew I had to do something. And so the freedom journey that I was on, and I still am on, to me is no different than the journey of African American people who on plantations. You know, we're not fully free because we're still having conversations around being treated equal or being treated in a certain way that's not the same as the dominant culture. And so it's my desire to be free that continues to push me and drive me. And it's dangerous work because I'm vulnerable in the context that I actually had to make parole. And as long as you're on parole in the state of Tennessee, they can come snatch you with a lie. So I have to protect myself, watch what I'm doing, but I also have to look back at those fallen soldiers who took bullets for the work. And so it's the Freedom Campaign.
Right to Jamel.
I want to sit there and hold my family here. Like I said before, my family's been here for 10 generations. If you name it, mass incarceration, in like the 90s, a lot of my family was caught up, swept up in like a RICO charge that took down a lot of people in Nashville. It took away, it dispossessed like 8 of my uncles went to jail off of that. A couple of them died in TDOC facilities and a lot of that. But I want to say also, because a lot of the times we orient ourselves to these conversations around these things. Not only are we looking through a misogynist or male-dominated framework, but we're also looking at a framework of tremendous harm. So I don't want to just focus on that, but the main reason why I do this is not only for my family and my family's experience, and also my experience growing up in the highest incarcerated zip code in the country, 37208, but specifically is my faith that I know that we can change this situation and improve our conditions as a people, right? And also that we can only do it through organization. We can't buy our way out of this. We cannot increase our wealth out of this. The only way we can do it is through the networks that the people in here possess, the people online possess, and through organization. And I really do believe that if you look at any moment that the people, and I'm centering Black folks, but I'm talking about all people, have progressed, whether it was through the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SCLC, any of those moments where we all progressed, it was through the relentless organizing of people. It was not a one-off elected official. It was not a one-off advocate. It was not a one-off wealthy person. It was not a one-off business owner. It was through relentless organizing of the people. And I know we exist in a very specific time, right? We all know that there's a problem. At one point in time, you had to argue with people about that, right? But you can walk into a room, you can walk into a room and be like, gentrification is a problem. And everybody be like, yes, it is an issue, right? And I think what's there is amazing potential to start talking to our homies, our loved ones, our people, and start asking, what do we want and who we need to go talk to and demand it from, and who we need to be putting pressure on to get it done. We exist in that time. And so I want to make sure that we orient ourselves towards these problems can be solved and scarcity is a myth.
Thank you for that. Before I go to my next question, I do want to share, since I'm a panelist / moderator, so I would share kind of what actually brought me to this work. I still remember the day I'm sitting in a criminology class here at Vanderbilt as an undergrad. And I remember we came to the section on prison. And I remember the professor coming in the room and gave some of the most disparaging statistics about Black people in prison. And to me, he seemed to be enjoying that a little. And something about being like the only Black student in that room at that time lit a fire in me. I wasn't thinking about studying in prison. But that day in that class, I made up my mind that there's something more to these stories. There's people behind these stories. There's people behind these numbers. And so I left that class and I took the juvenile justice class, I took law and society. I went on to take the prison life class, the class I ended up teaching. And through that became the topic of my dissertation. My dissertation focused on prison violence and things that happen in behind prison walls. And that's what ultimately brought me into contact with Rahim. So for me, the thirst and quest to know more about the story and the narrative. I also do have family members who've been unfortunately swept up in the system as well. And on the subject or topic of being in the system and swept up in the system, I do know that a personal motivator for Rahim is his own personal experience. I've heard you say this on a number of occasions. How important is it that people that have been impacted by the system are part of the push to change towards actually dismantling it, fixing it?
Yeah. So I want to go a little deeper so I can make it so personal that you can't miss this. So I'm from the number 2 zip code that's locked up the most, 37207. And I was caged with 5 of my biological brothers. A lot of people don't know that I was a cellmate with 3 of my biological brothers. And when you have an experience of being in the prison industrial complex, the criminal punishment system, that experience in and of itself provides you with information and knowledge that your body possesses, your memory possesses. And often we see people talk theoretically about mass incarceration and what these numbers are, which in some ways dehumanize the people who are actually behind these bars. And so I think we bring language to the experience that's different than how it's spoken about in the academy. For example, we don't use state language to talk about what we're trying to do on this freedom campaign. We don't say inmates. We might say insiders, prisoners. We don't say ex-con. We might say formerly incarcerated. We try as much as we can not to use state language, which is in a way dehumanizing slave language, to give perspective. So you have to hear the voices of the people who have actually had those experiences, because if you don't know what it feels like to be in that kind of situation, you can talk about it from what you read about, but you don't know it like within your being, in your ontological self, like you were there, like it's in your soul, man. And so that's why our voices have to be at the table. And even more than that, when people try to talk for you, speak for you, who don't represent you, you didn't vote for them, it's a difficult situation because they may say things that you don't believe in, that you don't agree with. So we have to have those voices of people who actually have had that experience and speak direct about that experience. And I never sanitize the experience. I want them to know that it is a form of slavery. People's bodies are being used to support 6,000 plus individuals working in this system. They feed their families because they have 41% of my people caged, and we're like 17% of the state's population, right? And they eating off of us like this. And then we go into the system of so-called corrections, and then we right back with a 46% recidivism rate here in Tennessee, but United States wide, 75% of the people. So there is even no accountability for transformation. There's no such thing as rehabilitation. It doesn't exist. And so somebody needs to answer to that. And if our voices aren't speaking with that passion about the realness of what this is, I don't know that it's going to matter much, but it has to be more than conversation. Yes, we are going to have to organize. Prisoners will have to, and they are actually organizing as we speak, because 1 in 5 can't even vote. 430,000 Tennesseans can't vote. So you mean to tell me with a stroke of a pen, you took what my ancestors died for, fought for, bled for? You took mine and you didn't even tell me you was going to take it. They say it's collateral damage. And so there's certain things that have to be said, and we have to say it.
Thank you for that. Jamel, I had a question for you, because I think the first time I ever actually met you, we didn't actually meet, but it was at the confirmation for the various members of the National Community Oversight Board. Tell us about what is the purpose of that board, first and foremost, and then I'll kind of hit you with some follow-up questions about the National Community Oversight Board.
I'll answer that question, but I want to rewind to something that Raheem just said that was so beautiful. I think when it comes to like organizing our folks, and we try to do this with the Black National Assembly, it is very important that folks who are directly impacted are at the table, because you want their input on whatever solution that you're organizing for, right? So at the Black National Assembly, what we do is we try to bring as many directly impacted people to the table, and folks that are also family members of those directly impacted folks who are also directly impacted, to have a conversation and a shared analysis on what the problem is. But as soon as you get a shared analysis of what the problem is, it's like, what is the solution? Who else do we need here? And how do we need to organize ourselves in our networks to get those solutions rebuilt so that we don't have to constantly be getting harmed in the same way over and over again? I wanted to stay there. But the Community Oversight Board is, and I would love to like have a conversation one day about the effectiveness of oversight, right? Because I don't ever think that you can really provide oversight of any of these institutions, because their number one aim is to adversely affect Black folks, right? So also these institutions are acting in the way that they're meant to act in the first place. So what the Oversight Board is supposed to do in theory is it is supposed to be able to have independent investigations of police misconduct. So you all supposed to have the ability to go tell an independent investigator about a complaint that you have around Metro Nashville Police Department, which you all's Vandy PD are MNPD officers. And then you get an independent investigation, and then that independent investigation delivers a set of recommendations to the police chief, right? And then the police chief can decide, Chief Drake can decide whether to do what the Community Oversight Board has said done or not. And I just want to mention this about the Community Oversight Board is it is civilian led, right? MNPD has their own oversight board. It's called OPA, Office of Police Accountability. Those are police officers investigating police officers. So you can imagine what's wrong with that scenario. Yeah.
I can't help but pick up how you kept stating in theory. You've been on that board now for a couple of years. Talk about, I guess, the differences with regards to what you thought it would have been going in versus the reality of what's back.
Yeah, so my experience as a Community Oversight Board member is what informed my politics as an abolitionist. Experiencing a command structure that is paramilitary, right, that is self-aggrandizing or self-acknowledging, or in other words, self-exploitive. They exploit themselves to exploit others. And also running into, let me explain it this way. So the Community Oversight Board was created through a democratic process that's an actual amendment to the Constitution of of Nashville, right? Just think about that. And the police can still violate it anytime they want to. So nobody or no institution should have absolute power over the people of its own area like they do. If you look at the way our city is laid out when it comes to the government, it's the mayor and then it's the police chief right up under it. The police chief don't have to answer to nobody but the mayor. And if you have a mayor like Cooper, who doesn't have the gall or the gumption or the political will to actually rein in law enforcement, then you get a Chief Drake or a Chief Anderson who just does whatever they want, whenever they want, and will tell you that they're actually listening, right? So that's why I frame it as a theory, because it's still a bunch of people making decisions to better suit their own position.
And to the outside world, at least the transition from Anderson to Drake somehow sold that progress. What's your take on that?
Well, and Rahim kind of went in this direction when he started talking about representation. I think there's holes in representative democracy, right? Or things like representation. We get confused as people to think that that's some kind of way progress. But what actually ends up happening is it's just a new harm happening with the more familiar face. There's no actual change that's happening, right? Because what we all are experiencing on a day-to-day basis is policies that were created by people, right? And so representation doesn't equal power for people. It only equals, it's only a facade, or it's only a look. It's not actually like tangible. Nothing really changed. It's just a new person in front of you.
And for those who don't know, like our former chief of police Anderson was identified as white, and our chief Drake is identified as black. That's why it was kind of it's progress. We have a black police. Much like when we had a black president, things that really because of the policy. To that point, I want to shift focus and come back to you, Rahim, and thinking about the criminal justice system, or injustice system, as I sometimes throw that in because I've heard you use that term as well, is a mammoth of an organization. Oftentimes in teaching the prison life class, I will have a student who is lit on fire at the end of the semester. It's like, I want to go change the system. Like, have you ever eaten an elephant? Because the system is just that big, right? If there was any one particular area that you felt like was like a critical linchpin of place or space where if we devoted more of our abolitionist activism efforts at this particular area, the impact of that would resonate into so many other areas, what would be that area for you? I have one in mind, but I want to see it for academically match up.
Yeah, so in my mind, I'm thinking about it from more than one perspective, because I look at it like bodies are being fed into the criminal legal system, and we know how that happens, right? So we know what over policing looks like, right? But that's something that happens before we even get to police. And that's what happens in the legislature. And when you disenfranchise almost 500,000 people, really, that power to have a voice, to have a vote in certain situations, in those policy changes, because a lot of things that happen when people end up in places like, see, people make felons through legislature. Like the 13th Amendment, slavery is prohibited except if you've been duly convicted of a crime. Those who codify the crimes and make the crimes actually create the situations or the legality for criminals, so-called criminals, to even come into existence. And so I kind of look at the root of the whole thing. And then when you look at who are the power players, see, then you start looking at it like so for example, we have a DA in Nashville that has so much power, he removed the mayor from office, right? The same DA witnessed a police officer execute a black man in the street, right? And he gets a slap on the wrist. I shoot a gun into the floor, the bullet ricochet. You give me a life sentence, you want me to die. I do my time, you get a slap on the wrist. And so I'm saying it's the power players, right? The brother just spoke beautifully. The system has to be abolished. There's really nothing that can change. So, but if we want to frustrate it in some ways, then we actually have to look at the laws. And right now in Tennessee, there is a bill where there is they call him Leader Lambert. And I name names so people are clear on what I'm saying, because there's no secrets, who is trying to implement a situation where parole is going to be eliminated, right? And not only that, but people are going to be doing more time in prison, right? And so I'm looking at like what allows for people to even be in those places. So that's the legislature. That's how I'm looking at it right now. But other than that, my people, where I'm from, we were uneducated. The literacy situation, and they know when you don't even have reading skills, kind of like what's going to happen with the poverty, you're going to end up doing something. And they got all these laws already in place for you to go straight to prison. So I think it has to be something on the front end, because then I'm thinking about single parent mothers, even single parent fathers, but I'm thinking about single parent mothers like mine. Their babies are targeted for prison. So we got to kind of stop it in one of those areas, because we don't need them in the system. So we got to stop it in the community. And that's going to take, we got all these churches on every block. But when it comes to organizing and getting involved in demonstrating power, it's like a funeral when, it's nothing. So I'm gonna say somewhere before it's prison, because anything after, you done.
Jamel, you want to chime in on that one?
No, I think that was poetically, I think that was poetically put. I think the solution to all of this, and I think Raheem even got to it, right? Like when we're having conversations, and as organizers, you know, people gonna tell you what the solution is, right? We just identified one thing. We got to work on literacy, right? And any solutions that are born out of this is going to lead directly to a policy change or a shift in what our elected officials are doing. If you look at locally, like our city council, right? Right now, Nashville is in a housing crisis. But when you pan out and look at how our city has invested in housing versus how it has invested in police over the decade, then you begin to paint a different picture, right? For instance, for example, over the last 10 years, Nashville has invested over, I think, $1 billion in police, while at the same time have invested under 50 million in housing. So when you look at that spending priority, that's not a surprise that we would be in the housing situation that we're in. So a lot of this goes not only down to the actions of our elected officials, but how our city is spending their dollars, what is the investments going into. And if I can bring up one more example, the American Rescue Plan money that was passed down by Biden, right? That was unrestricted cash that was sent to the states and the cities to take care of problems that were brought about by COVID, right? What we're seeing across the country is we're seeing local governments give it to police. Even in Nashville, right? Recently, our elected officials gave $8.23 million to MNPD for 125 SUVs. And I'm pretty sure if we had like a 20-minute conversation with the people online or in this room, we could figure out 15 other things to give that $8 million to that would actually improve the lives of all of us. So I think that's just a glimpse into the errors and the misuse and the corruption that is happening right now today that I think we can all organize, both get around and change.
I like you bringing that up. I think, Raheem, you mentioned something about the DA as well. Brother Jamel, you mentioned education. I think one of the things that often goes, is unfortunate rather, is that a lot of people are completely uneducated even about how the system works. When I think about the number of students, we don't realize that DAs are elected officials. But that's an election that most people don't even pay attention to. When, to me, when I think about prosecutors and just absolute power, absolute discretionary power, there are so many other linchpin areas where if we had the right-minded person there, and actually was given the opportunity to kind of come and make effective change. The prosecutor has the ability and the authority to say, you know what, yes, I'm going to charge you. The prosecutor has the ability to say, you know what, I'm not going to send this to the man. We're going to figure out an alternative for this kind of situation. So I think one of the things that I always try, I put, in addition to all the things that you guys have mentioned here, is to think about those power players. How did they get that power? A lot of them got that power because we blindly gave it to them and continue to give it to them. So I always push and encourage you to kind of be more diligent about all of our elections as they come up. I want to shift it and go back over to Jamel for another question real quick. In Nashville recently, I don't watch the news as much anymore because it seems like we've had way more police involved shootings. What's your take and perspective on why things appear to be getting worse right now in Nashville in particular?
Yeah, because the last year we've had like a 400% increase in police shootings. I think it is the facade that things have changed. I don't think that I think it's been the same this entire time as far as how police have exploited us. I think that there is a group of folks, maybe Black, that will see Chief Drake or Black police chief and be like, oh my God, it's going to get better, and not really understand that the causes of the violence are systemic, right? It's at the policy level, it's in the institution. So it's going to continuously happen, and one new person is not going to change it. Also, when last year, it's not a coincidence, and we also, I think, as people who are in Nashville, live here or stay here, or go to school here, I think this is one thing that we're gonna struggle with is why does MNPD always get a raise through our city dollars? Whether they're doing a good job or a bad job, our streets still aren't safe, but yet we are still giving them more money, more resources, more weapons, and that doesn't work, right? But I do think at this point in time, there is a lot of people who understand that we cannot continuously do that. I think one thing that the George Floyd uprisings brought about is this very diverse conversation around what public safety is, right? I think there's an acknowledgement that is happening that public safety means better housing, access to food, good paying job. 10 years ago, it would have only meant police, right? And I think that gives us a North Star where we need to be pointing towards, is getting these things to be considered very foundational to how our communities are safe, and then advocating for those.
I do like and appreciate the fact that you brought up that things haven't necessarily changed. It makes me think back to before George Floyd. As a Black person, you would have had a hard time convincing people that this is really what's happening when we encounter the police. But something about that video is like all of a sudden, like, we're telling the truth. And I think now is the reality is we got a lot more wannabe news reporters that we're about to phone and record something. So it may seem like there's more, but in actuality, things really happen.
Can I say something that I would like as it relates to policing? I think a part of the reason why I think the problem continues to grow, there's no accountability. And if you can keep shooting me and nothing happens to you, then why would there be a change? Because there's no consequences for their behavior, right? You know, how can a woman go into somebody's house, I thought it was my house, kill me, and then you get practically a slap on the wrist? I'm saying it's the accountability. And when you look at how police talk to one another in this fraternity, the blue lives matter and all this kind of stuff, we fail to realize that police are Johnny come lately. They never prevent anything from happening on the community level. They after the fact. We don't need you after the fact if you can't do nothing before it even happens. And so we misappropriate our funds by, because people can show up after the fact, right? What can you do to stop it? And so I think that, and then, we need to understand policing dates all the way back to, slavery. Like you want to hunt down the person that's running from the plantation. And I just kind of think the culture and the energy around policing is still mixed in. So I just wanted to make that statement.
And if I could add one more thing, because I wanted to build on Rahim's painting of, the realistic that the institution of policing was really born out of slavery, right? And if we hold that as accomplished, then we know that police are actually an extension of the exploitive nature of the economic system that we live up under, right? So a lot of this is just like rooted in exploitation and being able to guard and keep exploiting more and more and more people. That's why, really, personally, and like we use abolition as a driver towards what are we trying to solve, right? What do we do to address harm in our community that doesn't both, one, perpetuate the harm, but also can transform the conditions from which that harm took place?
There's a couple of follow-up questions I want to have based on both of you guys' responses there. Rahim, you mentioned the police as just Johnny come lately and that they show up after the fact. One of my questions that I had partitioned out for Jamel was when the New York City Guard, which was like one of our first formalized police departments, and in terms of what we know police departments look like today. At the time when it was formed, it had a requirement that you had to live in the district that you patrol. From your perspective, with the community organizers that you interact with and engage with, would having a residency requirement, would that change anything or do anything?
So I'll say a lot, and I think this is why, first, I want to say, like, I went to Tennessee State University and I graduated with a degree. So history is very much foundational to me. So Tennessee was, before it became a state, it was in 1796. was actually a territory of North Carolina starting in 1706. 3 years later, North Carolina, the Carolina Territories, begins its first slave watch, as far as slaves trying to escape from the Carolinas to the West, right? I think that's important to hold. And then also when it comes to the question that you just posed, I'm trying to get my words together. I want to say and hold that we've tried that before. If you looked at Lyndon B. Johnson's Safe Streets Omnibus Control Act, I know that's a wild title, but he pumped hundreds of millions of dollars into local police forces in the 60s across the entire country. And one of the things that they tried was putting beat cops or officers in their community. Nothing changed. So I think even when it comes to this community-oriented policing strategy, which is where we get the word cops from, which a lot of the times you will hear people start talking about community policing, it's going to keep happening because it is baked into it, right? And so I think when it comes to reform, we have these two things. I don't want to get into it right now. I think this is like a great conversation, and this is going to take a lot more conversation. But there's two different types of reforms. There's reformist reforms, which means that we're gonna still hurt you. We just gonna hurt you a little bit less. You know what I'm saying? We're still gonna cage you. We just gonna put pillows on the wall. Still gonna be in a cage though. Or reforms that actually lead towards abolition. We want to shrink the powers of police, and we want to reinvest and invest more into the educational system, into housing, into fresh food, into good paying jobs, because we know that those things are the drivers of people continually and perpetually harming each other.
One thing that I want to shift to you, Brother Rahim, and give you a chance to speak on this one. One of the things that I often bring up or talk to students about is how easily and how quickly they can find themselves on the wrong side of the law. We all know about the criminal justice system funnel, at least those of us on the stage, and that if you make the assumption that the only people that ever commit crimes are the ones that you see in prison, you are horribly mistaken. All of us probably did something in the last week or two that just only difference between us and people in jail or prisons, we didn't get caught. The people who make it through the funnel, Rahim, as a person who's been previously impacted, what are some of those commonalities that you see among people? And before you go into your answer, I do want to chime out and throw that. The last 3 years that I've taught the prison life class, I've encountered former Vanderbilt students on my tours who were not there as tour guides with us. They were former students who were actually in prison. So know that. What are some of those commonalities of the folks who actually make it through that funnel that you saw from your experience?
Yeah, so when you look at the poverty connection, it doesn't just end with the fact that you get charged. That poverty carries over into the criminal legal system, and you cannot get the right representation, right? And so you get these indigent defense attorneys who are actually in connection, in cohort, I would say, with the system itself. So there is this scheme to plead people guilty. Over 90% of cases end with guilty pleas. So these people who end up in prison, poverty, single parent homes, education issues, mental health issues, right? And so they know who ends up in prison, like the system, the demographers, people know how people end up in prison, right? But then you have these areas where people can be diverted. You spoke of the prosecutor. There is an abuse of authority where these prosecutors charge people at a higher level than what the evidence is, and they use that as leverage. And then when you have people who actually are working in the system who are not adversarial when you need a defense attorney, but are, I don't really know the language for it, but I do know this. In Nashville, there's an attorney It's on the record at YouTube, on YouTube, calling a black man, you know, the N-word. He accounted for he's in the top 5 of appointed cases by judges. And so these judges are feeding these indigent defense attorneys. And these indigent defense attorneys are helping these judges clear their dockets, right? And so this narrative is not known in a way that it really is how it's happening. And so everybody except the person who is charged with an offense, you know, is being rewarded. And they're not being called out for what they're not doing, because here's the problem. If I get $1,000 a case, I get $50 an hour, and I'm spending, you know, 100, you know, how much can I spend on that one case? I'm only getting $1,000 for this case, $50 an hour, right? And so you know what the end result is going to be. And so that many people, people don't have to go in. It's just they don't have a right defense, because sometimes you got to mount up. And, you know, to use one of, I don't know if you are familiar with Tupac, but in one of his Against All Odds, at the end of the song, he said, you know, y'all told me not to go to war unless I get my money right. And now I got my money right. I'm ready to go to war, right? You can't fight these folks when your money ain't right. You see what I'm saying? Because you're going to get passed through the ball. So that's my response. It probably isn't but that's what I see.
A few more. Let me ask one more question. This is one I really want to get in. Dr. Khalil Muhammad, who's a professor at Harvard, posed a question. And I'm posing this question to Jamel. I posed this question to my students last semester as well. Do you believe that the vast majority of white people in America still want the police to protect their interests over the rights, dignity, and lives of Black and brown people?
Yes.
You want to elaborate on that?
I mean, I think if we put some facts around policing, I think Rahim mentioned one, right? They come after the fact. 2, they're meant to protect property. 3, they're meant to protect those with means. And if we look at the wealth gap, it is only growing. So if we look at all of that information, the answer is yes to what you're saying. Now, what I do believe, though, is I do believe that the acknowledgement that there is something inherently wrong with police and prisons is at an all-time high amongst everybody. I do believe that has increased. Me, myself, very specifically, I saw Eric Brown, Tamir Rice, Breonna Taylor, and I'm pretty sure I can list a whole lot of uprisings that I have witnessed in my life. And I believe that there's way more of an acknowledgement that there is something intrinsically and structurally wrong with policing and prisons. It's not good just to have Black guards. It's not good just to have all Black police force, because they are still going to commit the same violence that police and prisons has constantly committed. So do I believe that the majority of folks in the country want police to protect their wealth? Yes. Do I also believe that there's a larger acknowledgement that police and prisons represent an structural violence in our community? Yes.
I would agree with that. And before we go to open it up for questions, one of the things that I also like to push is I think we, at the height of George Floyd, we had everybody's attention. Everybody was paying attention. I think we're losing some of that. I think the momentum of that window for really making some form of systematic and large-scale structural change, that window is kind of closing more and more as we get further and further away from it. And I think that's the part that's scary.
Yeah, same here. I think it's also like something called movement capture. If we could think about it, I think, and we can get into this, the exploitative nature of nonprofits, right? But I think like the social justice apparatus is able to capture our movement in ways where we can't capitalize off of them. One thing, the reason why the Black National Assembly was even created is because we had realized throughout the George Floyd uprisings that we were mobilized, but we didn't have a demand, a collective demand that we could go and be like, but we want this, right? And so since we didn't already have that collective demand around like something like a guaranteed basic income, or we wasn't put into organization, we weren't able to fully keep the momentum going. But I do think it is a lot more people that are still ready to get active, but are only looking for an organizational home, which I want to also inspire everyone to go do. Find an organization and join up.
I want to comment to that because I think that when you talk about the movement, the momentum, you know, Ahmaud Arbery's killers on trial and for the second time, I just want to say something that I saw happening when America was kind of like, oh, feeling guilty. It wasn't so much that's like we want to see justice. It's like I feel so guilty that I saw one of my own people, you know, from the white dominant culture of it, like, you know, because the knee has been on the necks of Black people, like not just symbolically, but, you know, like historically for all the things that have been happening. And then they saw this happen, like play out in real life TV, right? And it's like, damn, that's one of us. We gotta, you know, put some money into this. Here's the problem that I saw. I was bail fund at the time. You got this organization, millions and millions of dollars over here, the Bail Project. Then you got the Community Justice Exchange over here, $80 million over there. You mean to tell me you can't funnel some of that money back to the people who on the ground?
That's that nonprofit.
Yeah, the nonprofit industrial complex.
That's that social justice.
And so what they do is they hoard these funds and they give out the crumbs, and the people who really need them, the grassroots organizers on the ground, they hardly see this money, right? And so I want to call that out because I'm sick of these people who are saying they're in solidarity with us and they really are. And when you look on their boards and the people that get paid to be, like, they ain't looking like the folks, you know what I'm saying? And that's just real stuff. And so I'm saying that momentum, we lost some of it because they didn't put that money in the places where, because we could have took that. And like I said, you know, against our odds, you know, we could have, you know, so I just want to, you know, make sure that that's clear. So I want the people to know, and they know who they are. Like, they heard me say it. Yeah.
That's real. I don't want to keep dominate the conversation, but I left y'all 6 minutes. If anybody got a question that you want to chime in with, I can stay here and chat with you brothers all day. But anybody online or in the room have a question?
I would recommend getting involved. Recently 18. I never heard of it.
I'm a punt to my brother here because
Yeah,
I know
so
he's working
I'll
on
give
that.
and my brother here, I know he has something to say. Here's what I'm gonna say. So we're doing the Nashville Community Court Watch, right? And really, it's not just go and watch people in court. It's kind of like as a way to get people around and look into an issue. Like Nashville 2022 elections, all the judges basically that matter are up for election, right? The DA is up for election, right? And I think that the chief public defender may be up for election. I don't really know, but what I'm saying is that we have some elections about to come up, right? And like, we don't even know the people we're voting for. We don't know their resumes. And so I want to urge all Vanderbilt students everywhere who can't vote to, you know, like look into this system, you know, because like we really need to know who we're voting for, because these judges have the ability to affect the lives of human beings in ways that, whereas they put ransom on the heads of individuals who are being charged with a crime and they can't get out of jail, right? Not because they're guilty of anything. It's just that because you think they're guilty, you're gonna put some price on their head that's so high that they can't make, and then you don't know you're gonna traumatize that person for the rest of his or her life, right? And so these elections are coming up, and while the system still exists, we gotta work. So yeah, elections are coming up. All of y'all need to participate. And so with the National Community Court Watch, we do these trainings so that we can decentralize operations in a way that like people can go in doing their own court watching. You don't have to get with one organization or another. Once we show you what you need to do, you go in and do it, and then you show up, and then you go out, and then you vote.
And at the Black Nashville Assembly, we're having the State of Black Nashville Town Hall on February 26th. We did it last year. We're doing it again this year. And what you'll hear from is you'll hear from grassroots organizers, current elected officials, and people who hold certain positions. And they'll talk about on panels, and they'll talk about things like young people, youth justice, the criminal legal systems when it comes to Black Nashvillians. At the Black Nashville Assembly, we do like mass meetings where we train up, skill up. So our last mass meeting was on a judicial election. We do also acknowledge that a lot of our people are disenfranchised. So we're not only looking for voters, we're also looking for people who don't vote, won't vote, and have nothing to vote for, right? Because political engagement, a lot of the times, we like to shrink political engagement down to voting when you can actually be politically engaged year around, right? And so those are a couple of events, but I did want to mention on February 26th, we're having a Black Nashville Assembly Town Hall, the state of Black Nashville, but you can go to blacknashvilleassembly.org to sign up. It's hybrid, it's both.
Awesome. So one question that we had multiple times online was asking what could potentially be a replacement for the abolished current structures and how can allies help in creating that change?
So I'm gonna answer in reverse. I think what allies and what everyone could do is find an organization. I'm always going to be organization, because you need people that you are held accountable to. You also need people to walk along the journey with you. Other folks of means, I would say find an organization, donate to it, right? Donate your time, donate your money, but not in a way that is trying to control the organization, but in a way that is like, yo, I have these skills, let me donate. 3, when it comes to abolition, I think, and a lot of the times we don't get this as Black people, I think we deserve the opportunity to experiment, figure out what's going on, how we can do it together, and then try it. I do know that there are things that are happening across the country, even in the globe, where they do not use police to settle neighbor to neighbor harm. If you look at communities like communities in Jamaica, where they don't have the money to throw countless dollars at tanks and militarized police, they actually have these restorative centers that are in every community that if you are experiencing some sort of harm with your neighbor, there's a mediator there that is a credible messenger for the entire community, somebody that we all love. I'm pretty sure everybody has grown up around one of these people, and they are able to figure out a solution that doesn't involve punitively hurting one another, right? Those things happen globally. But I do know one thing, that the system that we have now destroys, eliminates, and kills Black folks. So we have to start looking towards the global and what other countries are doing, just so we can start experimenting. And these are happening across the country. One place is North Carolina, Spirit House. They do these things called, and that's a network of Black folk. They do these things called harm-free zones, where they are actually like implementing restorative practices and transformative practices to not only root out harm, but to detect it early on, so then it doesn't escalate, but then also put in safety measures to where we're not constantly experiencing escalating tension. Yeah.
Great. So one more question we had from some of the students in our online audience was, what are ways in which students can hold adults and professors accountable when they use othering language, like for instance, the word inmate?
Say hold I'm accountable. I don't really know exactly what that means in the academy. I think that you just correct people on the spot. That's just how I am. Like, that's just the way I am. Like, and it's, you do it with respect, like, because some people just don't know. But the academy itself should know better in terms of language. And I think like here, the Vanderbilt Prison Project is really a cool organization that understands what's going on. You know, right now we're involved in shooting a documentary, Unchained Destiny, disrupting the criminal legal system. And so you got to go to places where people understand. But that accountability thing, I just don't, you know, we just got to stop it ourselves.
I would agree. I think there's no like correcting people on the spot. It's no different than somebody mispronouncing. Somebody mispronounced you in that moment. Like most people are very quick and apt to correct them, but doing it in a respectful fashion. One last question, Logan, and I'll let you.
I'll try to take a swipe at it, Logan. When it comes to, let me say this first, because a lot of the times when we look at organization, we think of a big old structure. What I mean by organization is like coming together, holler at your homies, figure out what you want, right? What's the principles that's going to guide our decisions, and let's go get it. You know what I'm saying? So I want to say that first, and that could also be the solution to the previous question that the other person asked: is organization, right? How we hold teachers accountable, organization. It's always going to go back. But I think one piece that is a hindrance to organizing is political education, right? We all got to have a similar analysis of what's going on, and we all got to be honest about our analysis, right? If that honesty and that shared analysis is not there, you are already working one hand behind your back anyway. And I'm not talking about all agreeing, but all agreeing that this chair is a chair and we need to sit in, very basic.
I want to, and I agree with everything that was just said. Organizing. One of the problems with some of, the organizing from like what we're doing from like people in prison and then their family members is that people work 9 to 5s, 8 to 4s, whatever. They don't really have the energy to like get involved, right? And so we have to be creative in getting, like people involved. And so like with my organization, like funding is a big deal. Like you can't do this work if you can't pay your bills. You just can't. I don't care who you are. Otherwise, you got to work somewhere else. And then you got to get off that job and then you try to do what you're doing, right? And so what I would say is that when you can organize and money isn't an issue, find that problem. But we don't have to find the problem. We're talking about the problems. Problems already exist. It's just like, what do we want to do about those things? Like, I need to put this out there. Like, for example, with the Vanderbilt prison project, we got a lady in prison who's been caged since she was 14 years old. Her name is Shonda James. We're organizing to free her from the cages of Tennessee prison, right? Now, we need more than 300, 400, 500 people to be involved in this process. Sometimes it's just showing up with a show of force. Have you watched that Malcolm X movie? And the police said, when the FOI showed up and they was like deep in the streets and they were disciplined, and he said, no one man should have that much power. Power is in the people, and politics we address, right? It's like our money is the reason why all these industries, these state agencies, and all these people are able to be, because we pay their bills. But sometimes when they're not what they're supposed to be, we got to show up, and we got to be like, sometimes, I'm not advocating violence here either, but I'm just saying sometimes you got to show up on a level to let it be known, like I'm ready to push back, like literally. You know what I mean? And that's organizing too. So that's my thoughts on the matter.
Give them a round of applause in person and virtual. I think, thank you all for joining us here tonight, and I apologize for you giving us an extra 4 or 5 minutes of your time, but I think this was a very powerful conversation that we literally could have kept going on forever. I generated a list of questions that I actually probably only got to about 1/3 of my questions. When I thought about the expertise of the folks that I've been on stage with, I really wanted to give you an opportunity to kind of pick their brains for this. So, thank you guys for being here again. And if you are a student and you're here, make sure you sign in out front so you get your T-shirt. Thank you guys.